Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining the Education Writers Association for this webinar on what's next for education in the wake of the 2020 presidential election. I'm Emily Richmond, EWA's public editor. We wanted to discuss President-elect Joe Biden's top education priorities and how uncertainty and political control of the Senate may complicate his agenda. There's also plenty of speculation on how the new administration could reshape everything from civil rights enforcement to the efforts to provide more pandemic-related financial support to both K-12 and higher education. We're fortunate today to be joined by two expert reporters who are paying close attention to these issues. Evie Blad of Education Week is co-author of the Politics K-12 blog. Evie, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And Chris Quintana, he is the higher education reporter for USA Today. Chris, we're very glad to have you here as well.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with what's the obvious question, and that is how President-elect Biden's approach might differ on COVID-19 response in schools. Evie, I'd like you to start with what we need to know on the K-12 side. What has been promised?
Yeah, so, aside from relief, one of the key issues for K-12 schools has been this concern about how to navigate conflicting guidance from state and federal agencies, whether they should be open at all, which is a very hot topic of discussion, whether they're being too cautious about remaining closed. And one of the concerns that school administrators have had since the beginning of this pandemic is that federal guidance has shifted and that sometimes it's been conflicting or difficult to interpret. So one of the things that the Biden administration has promised is new CDC guidance with clear benchmarks about when a school should be open, when it should be closed, that they say will be easier for local leaders to interpret. Some of the guidance has changed because our understanding of the pandemic has changed, and everyone emphasizes local control as far as, your community may be different from another. The Biden administration does that as well. This guidance will be sensitive to the needs of communities, apparently. And then the other part of that is that he believes that schools need a significant infusion of resources to continue operating, not only to deal with the immediate effects of the pandemic, but to deal with fiscal shortfalls, state and local revenue shortfalls, and to deal with the ongoing effects of what's going to result from this interrupted learning. And so those are kind of his big pledges.
And there may be some immediate money that could be tapped that wouldn't necessarily need, bipartisan approval. I'm thinking of things like FEMA. But as you've mentioned and written about, some of that money could only be used in limited ways. For example, to reimburse schools for personal protective equipment. Is that right? Right.
Because this is such one of those, what they call kitchen table issues. This is something folks have really focused on. The FEMA reimbursement issue is super narrow, but it's one that Biden honed in on during the campaign, which is that FEMA under President Trump essentially told state and local governments that they couldn't reimburse schools for things like personal protective equipment because that was part of their ongoing operations, not part of their initial disaster response. And the Biden administration has said that they would, or the Biden transition team has said that they would change the approach to that. So there are little regulatory things that they could do differently to how they allow money to be spent and used.
Well, I think it's interesting because in a normal time, as you said, this might feel a little bit like inside baseball, but it feels like the Biden administration is saying we're going to find money from whatever baseball game we can.
Yeah, or I don't even know if I don't know if they would say find money. I think they would say that's how the money should be used to begin with. Now, I think, what FEMA would say is this isn't disaster response money. Like, this is a very unique kind of disaster that we're in, right? And so they might say that there's just different ways to interpret that. Were you in a different position when you initially closed your school than you are now with ongoing operations? There are differences of opinion about that. So, but it does point to that beyond broad COVID relief bills, there are all kinds of ways, all kinds of choices within administrative control that a Biden administration could make that are different from what a Trump administration has made.
And what is the likelihood looking like of a COVID relief bill that would include help for public schools, during this interim period?
Well, Leader McConnell has said that that's on his agenda during the lame duck. He wants to really push for that. There are plenty of folks who, Council of Chief State School Officers yesterday said that is something that they're interested in. There are some really hot button issues on the K-12 end attached to the debate. GOP senators wanted to tie some of those funds to reopening. So your school had to be physically opened a certain number of days to receive a bulk of the funding. There's questions about how much of that funding should be allocated to private schools and whether some of it should be used for school choice initiatives supported by Betsy DeVos and Texas Senator Ted Cruz. There's some interest in providing scholarships so that families can seek education alternatives during this time when so many have had their education interrupted. That is probably not on the table for Democrats. The Senate's relief bill, Democrats blocked it and it hasn't gone anywhere. The gulf between what the Senate GOP proposed and what Speaker Pelosi and the White House was negotiating is quite a big amount. The other question is whether a relief bill would include money for state and local governments to help supplement funding that they've lost during the pandemic, which could have a very significant effect on state education budgets and schools' ability to retain teaching positions and programs and things like that. If it doesn't happen during a lame duck, the question is, there's also the potential for a lame duck bill and then an additional. We don't really know. We've got a very small amount of time to play with, and we've got Senate runoffs and a very contentious, it seems like, a transition period. So what that will mean for this, I don't know.
That's interesting. I think you're right. And certainly we've seen historically where appropriations have provided funding to backfill those state budgets, and looking back to the last recession. But really that was about lost revenue. It wasn't about also having these additional, I would call them startup costs of restarting schools remotely and figuring out ways to make the buildings safe. Chris, I want to bring you into this conversation. What are colleges and universities hoping from a Biden administration in terms of COVID relief? What are they hoping he'll do or say?
I think what we've heard a lot from colleges and universities over the last couple of months is just, they were included in that first round of stimulus. They haven't been received direct funding yet again. And so I think that is going to be what they're looking for, right? Pivoting to online education. I think there's a perception that maybe it's cheaper, but it's not. There are a lot of costs associated with going online, transferring classes, building up the infrastructure available for that. And then also just for the universities that were able to do it in person, we're talking about de-densifying the campus, potentially de-densifying the dorms. So there are a lot of people kind of hurting from that aspect. I think there's also a question of kind of if there will be more federal guidance for universities themselves. I think we saw, we were talking about conflicting guidance for K through 12 schools. That was definitely the case for universities. I remember earlier on in the year, the CDC didn't recommend mass testing. And in my reporting, I saw that a bunch of universities cited that for their reason to reopen without mass testing. We've kind of seen the effect of that. We've seen universities that have been able to implement a robust program along with other measures be more effective in kind of having students on campus. So, personally, I'm kind of curious about whether or not that will be kind of coming more into the fore. And then, obviously with Biden's plans there, we've got the potential for free college in the future, but maybe we can touch on that a little later. But I think funding right now is the question, and definitely federal guidance for folks who, didn't necessarily have that the first time around.
Well, let's branch out a little bit here and talk about some of those things that are also on Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden's agenda for education. And let's talk about what he could do and how he could do it. And that is, first of all, we've got a legislative agenda that could be hamstrung by a divided Congress, but then there's also executive action. And he has said that he has a number of orders that are ready to go to roll back steps that were taken by Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, who was in turn rolling back steps taken by the Obama administration. So Evie, is this 2 steps forward after 2 steps back? What are some of the things you're watching?
Yeah, well, at this point, the courts give broad discretion to, or give discretion to agencies to interpret federal policies in a way. They'll defer to the agency interpretation, right? Now, there are some Supreme Court cases that are tossing that precedent around. How can we apply that? But that has led to this situation where how the U.S. Department of Education interprets civil rights laws can change between administrations. The Obama administration was known for a pretty aggressive approach to education civil rights. I think they would use that word too. And the Trump administration was known for undoing a lot of things that the Obama administration did, and they would probably own that. Betsy DeVos said that, you know, she thought that the Obama administration, through what are called Dear Colleague letters, where they advise schools how they're going to apply civil rights laws and investigate, she felt like they were overreaching their bounds and almost legislating through interpretation. And so she rescinded a few of the high-profile documents, including whether transgender students' rights are protected under Title IX, which is the federal sex discrimination law. That's one that President-elect Biden has really honed in on, including in one of the town halls. He spoke to a mother of a transgender daughter. That's one that she rescinded the guidance and said it was an issue for states. But then the Trump Justice Department has weighed in on a lawsuit in which cisgender girls are suing because transgender girls are playing alongside them in sports. So they're kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth on that. So he might replace that. Also, a high-profile issue from the Obama era that might come back is the issue of school discipline and how you address racial disparities in school discipline. The core of that is what's called disparate impact. If a higher percentage of students of one race are affected by a policy, even if it maybe wasn't written with clear discriminatory intent, if it has discriminatory application, do the feds need to intervene? And does the school need to find an alternative discipline policy? And then the last one that I would say has been effect for both higher ed and K-12 is the issue of Title IX regulations for sexual assault and harassment, which when he was vice president, Joe Biden played a big role in the It's On Us response to sexual assault on college campuses. And he has criticized Secretary DeVos's rewriting of those regulations, which allow schools to select different standards of evidence to prove whether a claim of assault or harassment is valid. It would be pretty difficult to rescind those right away because she went through the rulemaking process. But those are some things that we could see some back and forth on how the feds enforce those laws.
Well, Chris, let's talk about higher ed in terms of executive orders and actions. I mean, have you just mentioned Title IX? That's obviously a huge one for colleges and universities. And Evie, thank you for pointing out that that does apply to K-12 as well. I think there is this perception that that is only a higher ed issue, and it certainly is not. So Chris, let's start with that, and then I want to move on and talk about student loan debt, which I know is a very hot thing here.
Yeah, well, you know, I want to echo Evie's point here and say, you know, we did go through negotiated rulemaking with Title IX, and you know, I think there's going to be, you know, some effort to roll this back, but you know, kind of in the current landscape, I mean, the rollback, Betsy DeVos's rollback was a rollback of Obama era guidance, so it feels like we're kind of seesawing a little bit. But as I understand it currently, you know, we've rescinded some of the restrictions as far as the enforcement of Title IX goes. In the university space, you know, having the opportunity for the accuser to, you know, respond to the complaints. I don't know how quickly universities have implemented that and how quickly they can roll it back, but that's something I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on. And then, you know, I would also suggest if you're in that space, you can't beat Sarah Brown at the Chronicle of Higher Education. She follows that really closely. So I would say that that's something to focus on. When we talk about some of the other Biden policies in the higher ed space, you know, he's talked a lot about student loan forgiveness. In this conversation that EWA had with a Biden aide, they said that they wanted to take the legislative route and I just want to make sure that I'm correct here. To address student debt through legislation, $10,000 worth of forgiveness. And this was, popularized by Elizabeth Warren's campaign, obviously, and I don't think that's going anywhere anytime soon. I think there is some question about whether or not the extension of the federal pause that's in play right now, for federal borrowers, they're not required to pay back their loans, and the interest rate is set at 0 if my memory is correct. And so I think, if we're talking about coronavirus stimulus or relief, I have some questions about whether or not that will continue to be in play as well. And then, there are some smaller things, but things that I think are relevant to higher ed reporters. There's some questions about the funding of for-profit colleges, the 90-10 loophole. Biden has talked about closing that. There were also some rules rolled back kind of for accreditation. And so I'm kind of curious if we're going to see the same seesaw, kind of there as well. But again, the accreditation rules also went through negotiated rulemaking. So that's, again, a whole nother process that we'd have to encounter. And the other thing that kind of stands at the top of my mind that would probably, my crystal ball is in the shop, so I don't want to speak too concretely here, but I imagine something like doubling the Pell Grant would find pretty wide support, and Biden has talked about that as well.
Well, let's talk about the other areas where there could be support, where there may be some bipartisan agreement. Evie, I'm thinking about things that used to be pretty widely supported, like improving school infrastructure. It feels like right now, in the midst of this pandemic, where those deficits in school campuses in terms of their HVAC systems, in terms of just structural issues, that this is a great time to try to build that bipartisan network.
Yeah, we had a GAO report come out early in the pandemic that identified how many schools had, I think it was something like 40%, but I might be wrong, just significant need for HVAC upgrades. And that's a big concern for the virus spreading in schools. So, and in years past, we've seen videos of kids in Baltimore classrooms huddled around space heaters in the wintertime. And so it's been an ongoing issue. In the Trump administration, infrastructure in general was often cited as an area that there was some belief that a divided Congress and the president might be able to come together for things like bridges and online infrastructure, things like that. Now, the question of whether schools should be involved in that was a separate one, and one that, I think there were some in the GOP who believed it should be more narrowly focused on things like transportation. But, there are a lot of folks who are advocates for school funding who believe that this is a real moment to include schools in that. Vice President Biden has said that that would be a part of his plan. And things like broadband access, which are obviously a significant issue now.
So depending on who takes control of the Senate, and we may not know that until after the Georgia runoff at a minimum, how important is it, Evie, who's going to chair these different committees?
Yeah, well, to some extent, it depends on which party we're talking about. Right now we have ranking member Patty Murray for the Democrats. For Republicans, it could be Richard Burr, but likely not. We might go farther down. The next person on the list is Senator Rand Paul, which he would undoubtedly bring a different tone to, he has expressed skepticism about the existence of the Department of Education. And, we're also talking about, and right now the current chairman is Senator Alexander, who's retiring and has worked pretty closely with Senator Murray on issues like the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so one area of concern that folks have already pointed out is how contentious Secretary DeVos's confirmation hearings were. If we have Republican leadership of the Senate, would we see it? Can we put the toothpaste back in the tube? Are they just going to be that contentious from now on? I don't think I've ever heard so many people outside of the education world weigh in on their thoughts about the ed secretary. People in the education world have had problems with previous ed secretaries, but maybe not on the level that they're expressing now. So how they run that meeting, how they navigate the ins and outs of the political process, how they balance oversight and concerns like that could be different. But it's really a little hard to anticipate what's going to happen there.
Chris, what do you think about who might be the next education secretary? And you want to put on that crystal ball?
Well, I'm going to try to be as artful as I can here. I'm thinking that the next education secretary is probably going to be a former teacher, and so that may limit the space in the higher education sphere. So it's a little hard for me to, guess in that space, but just kind of throwing a random name, well, not a random name out there, but I'm thinking maybe Janet Napolitano. She's had experience running the UC system, has worked in the federal administration before. A little bit of a long shot, but when we're talking about kind of big infrastructure, big bureaucratic infrastructure, it's definitely a possibility. I mean, or that's a name that I would at least put on my list.
Well, certainly higher ed is going to have a pretty powerful advocate in another position, and that, of course, will be the First Lady. So what are people saying about what Joe Biden's influence might be, given that she's a longtime community college professor who has said she's going to keep her full-time job?
I think that's encouraging from the higher ed sector, especially given that sometimes I think it can feel as though higher ed is a second thought in the department. I don't not to undermine the work that anyone does there, but it does seem that the issues that come to the fore are often the K through 12 issues. So I think there is a hope by having someone who's in the White House who has such a strong connection to college and kind of knows the value of it, that will be influential in some way, shape, or form. And when you look at Biden's higher ed plan, I mean, we're talking about investing in institutions that have been historically underfunded, and who people say need more money. We're talking about community colleges. We're talking about minority-serving institutions. And I think with that focus, I think it may feel as though there's an ally in a space where higher ed folks may not have had as strong of an ally in recent past.
And certainly public institutions have an ally in University of Delaware graduate Joe Biden. I think I read somewhere that he's the first president in something like 54 years to have come from a public university. And then Kamala Harris, of course, coming from an HBCU.
Yep.
Those are both very interesting details. But let's talk about that, Evie, because that's something you and I have discussed, which is that it's not just about what policies might be enacted. There can be a trickle-down effect to this change in leadership and change in administration, even just in the tone or how we talk about education issues. What are you noticing or hearing people in terms of what this might mean to have a start with a fresh slate with a Biden presidency?
Yeah, so one of the things that the Trump administration is most known for in education is something that they didn't have any significant legislative achievements on, and that, at least to this point, and that is promotion of private school choice and using vouchers or tax credits to fund private school attendance for kids. And they repeatedly pressed this package, but it never passed, or it never even really got consideration. But that doesn't mean that they weren't effective. Betsy DeVos really promoted school choice. She really promoted state school choice programs. She really drove home this idea that schools needed to think outside of the box. And so there's some thought that changing even the way that these issues are discussed could have an effect. I think charter school advocates are a little concerned that Vice President Biden has criticized charters on the trail, that he's deprioritized them in his plans, and things like that. But I think administrators at traditional public schools are excited about the possibility that some of their needs and some of their considerations might be discussed a little bit more. And well, one other thing, sorry, is that is that Vice President Biden has expressed some skepticism about standardized tests and accountability and things like that. Some of those high stakes accountability measures. And I think that there are folks on both sides of the aisle really interested to hear how that translates into the policy coming from the department and what that means for holding schools accountable, for improving schools, and getting through the pandemic and what we're seeing now.
Well, Chris, let's talk about another area where there could be that trickle-down effect. And I'm thinking about, for example, all the young people who are here in protected status under DACA. And certainly we've seen more enforcement of immigration issues under President Trump, rounding up of immigrants in some unexpected places, places that used to be considered protected sanctuaries. I'm thinking near hospitals, near schools, near courthouses. What are you hearing on that front?
Well, so I can tell you kind of what I was hearing heading into it, and I think what the hope is for some folks is, there was I think like a chilling effect for international students and definitely our undocumented students as well, where it just made higher education feel like a less hospitable place. If you see everyone returning to campus, but then you get a special message from your university telling you, actually, we can't accommodate you this semester and you need to, you're going to have to study online. Like that doesn't necessarily, I think, endear universities to, these international students. So I think anything coming from kind of a federal perspective that would ease that kind of attitude would go a long way, and especially amongst undocumented students who already are navigating a very tricky situation, trying to deal with questions about citizenship, about, the status of their parents. Applying to college is already a fraught process. So I think if they when they had seen that, it was already so difficult to get into college, and when they were excluded from things like the CARES Act, right? I remember writing a story about that and how these students who are, paying tuition, going to school just like everyone else, who are also affected, some of them have jobs. When they're intentionally excluded from that and from with federal guidance making clear, I think that demoralizes people who are trying to get their degree. So I think anything that kind of eases that would go a long way. But when we're talking kind of just about what can the administration do tone-wise, we're also thinking about things like affirmative action, right? Like the Department of Justice has weighed in a couple of these cases, and it's hard for me to see that the Biden a Biden administration would feel as strongly as we've kind of as we have seen in the past. And the same for for-profit schools. I think there's been some question about to cite an example I've written about a lot. There's been a lot of controversy surrounding ACICS and kind of the education department's role in I'm trying to find the right word, reinstating them. The Obama administration had made an effort to strip this accrediting body of its power, and now it's back, and we've kind of seen what has happened there. So I'm looking for things like that, or to kind of got things that may not be exactly legislation or executive action, but that's what I'm paying attention to. And then just the last thing I would say is also, the Department of Justice over the last 4 years has expressed an interest in a lot of free speech cases on college campuses. I think that was perhaps a little bit more prevalent under, Attorney Jeff Sessions, but we also saw it with the Princeton case, right? If you acknowledge institutional racism, does that mean that your federal funding is now kind of at risk? And at the same time, Yale is talking about affirmative action, and that's not okay, but admitting institutional racism is. And so I think, seeing the attitude from enforcement from these federal agencies is something I'm going to be keeping a close eye on.
Well, I've also read that President-elect Biden has promised to reinvest in institutional research and at the Research One universities, and that feels to me like recommitting to the value that those universities play in the American economic engine. And that's not necessarily something that's going to be legislative action that's going to happen, but just even making that statement about the value of those higher education systems feels significant.
It does, and that kind of aligns what we've seen in the public perception of higher education. We tend to see that it has more support among left-leaning voters, and especially among right-leaning voters. There's a fear of indoctrination and kind of teaching students how to think, and the concern on the left side is not so much about are we brainwashing students, but can students afford to go to college? And that has been a persistent concern on the left.
I want to remind all of our attendees that you can enter your questions at any time in the GoToWebinar question box on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll get to them in just a couple of minutes. Evie, before we open it up to some additional questions from our attendees, I know that you've also been following some of the state level election outcomes, some ballot measures and some interesting races. And I think it's worth discussing here because, of course, we've just spent quite a bit of time talking about the impact of a new presidential administration, but the vast majority of what happens in K-12 schools isn't decided by the president or the federal government. It's decided at the local and state level by local school boards and state legislatures. Can you just tell us a little bit about some of the interesting races that you've seen and maybe if there are any themes there?
Yeah, well, one of them that was really interesting to me that maybe doesn't play into a theme because it's so unusual is that Washington state had its to my knowledge, the first referendum on statewide comprehensive sex education. The legislature had passed a bill that said, schools around the state have to teach sex education with certain characteristics. In elementary schools, it's more social emotional learning and responsible decision making. It's not despite some misinformation out there, it's not explicit teaching of concepts that might make parents uncomfortable. But that became an issue. Seattle reporters did a great job of writing about how that became an issue in the state schools chiefs race and what that meant. And that is interesting to me because states around the country have such varying policies about what kids can and maybe what they absolutely cannot learn in sex education. But something that plays into a greater theme is really just how are we going to fund schools? We're going to be watching state houses to see, how are we going to solve this mess that we're in? Because the pandemic hasn't just been a public health crisis, it's been a financial crisis, and it's going to have effects for a long time. And one of the most interesting state ballot questions that we saw was in Arizona, where taxpayers okayed taxing higher income earners, income tax, to help pay for schools. 50% of that is supposed to go to retaining and increasing the pay of teachers and classroom educators. And it's interesting because it kind of ran parallel to the national debate about the 1%. If I were an Arizona voter, I would have been pretty primed for this conversation by listening to all those Democratic debates about how we need to tax the billionaires. One concern about it, so Bernie Sanders weighed in, President Trump weighed in, it kind of became a parallel because Arizona is a significant electoral state. One concern, is that income tax going to be as steady and consistent as property taxes? But while we typically see education funded through property tax, through sin taxes on things like gambling and marijuana and things like that, this is an interesting question. Will we see more of this? And will it have success in other states like it did in Arizona?
I think if they could have taxed reporters on coffee and chocolate during this pandemic, we could have funded the nation's education system pretty handily. But that's right. That's just my assumption there. But let's say on this theme,
every time you say amid,
exactly, or amid the pandemic, without question. But let's say on this idea of looking at state and local impact, what are some story ideas for the local reporters in the audience who may not necessarily be covering the federal Department of Education or federal legislative policy? What should they be paying attention to right now as we make this transition? Chris, you want to start?
Yeah, so I had what I hope is a pretty simple idea, for the next time that a stimulus goes through, and if colleges do receive more direct funding, you can look at your local college and see how that money is being divvied up. For when that first went through, the USA Today network put out a query, we got a bunch of our local reporters to put out a query to their local institutions and be like, hey, how are you divvying out this money? And for some, you had to apply for it. And for some, it was just kind of a blanket, every student gets this. And, I think that's important because, people hear these stories kind of in broad, but they don't know how it's actually going to trickle down to them. And so, the federal government doesn't necessarily know how they're going to trickle down exactly to students either. So from a local perspective, that's something you can very easily do. I would also say kind of, from when we're talking about the Biden plan for funding colleges and making college free in some way, shape, or form, you have to look at your state funding as well, because there is an anticipation that states will chip in to make this a reality. And if you can look at your state funding and see, oh, we've been declining for the last couple of years, I think there are then some questions about how feasible a free public education really is at your four-year universities, and who's actually going to pay for it. I mean, the one that comes to mind, and granted I'm a little biased here, but the state of New Mexico, introduced initially what was supposed to be kind of a 2-year, 4-year plan for free public college, and they had to roll that back a little bit. So it's the program, I believe now, is free for community college, right? So it's like, if you can look at those things and try to anticipate out what that actually looks like in practice, I think that's an easy way to start.
Thank you. And Evie, what about you?
I would say one thing is, if you've had either a federal settlement in your district related to school discipline, transgender students, sexual assault, or if your district has had a debate over policies related to those, even if it didn't involve any federal intervention in recent years, I would check in and say, if there's a change in federal guidance on these issues, how would that affect the district's policy? And maybe it wouldn't at all. Maybe the district's policy wasn't strictly guided by that. I think a lot of districts that changed their discipline policies would say it was far more complicated than just following the federal guidance. But this idea that these rules are shifting like a pendulum, and that local leaders who actually have to put them into place are trying to keep up, is a really interesting one. And we're talking about things that sound like wonky policy, but if I'm a transgender child or a mother of a transgender child, I think that this would be, this is a huge deal to me. The other thing that might be interesting is, how has uncertainty over future pandemic relief for schools affected how they're spending what we already have? Because if you give me $5 and tell me it needs to last a day, I'm going to spend it differently than if it needs to last a week, right? And so, I wonder if schools have been reluctant to spend what they have, or how that's affected their priorities. And I would also just want to know really clearly, what would your needs be for new aid? I think that every school leader in the country is watching this debate, and if you could personalize it for your community and say, if we had more aid, we would buy Chromebooks that would allow kids to transition into remote learning more easily. That would be, I think, something that would be of great interest.
So a story I'd like to see happen, and it's actually a crossover story, because some of these young people may be high school seniors, some of them may be college freshmen or older, but first-time voters. Do some exit polling with folks who voted for the first time in this election, who are in those age groups where they're still students. Find out how they voted, why they voted, but I'm also interested in where they registered. So did they register on campus? Did they vote on campus? Did they have difficulty figuring it out or navigating it? Did they get any support or help from their high school or from a college professor? And how difficult or easy was that voting process? Because we've certainly seen a lot of early numbers that the youth vote had a pretty big impact here. So that's something I would definitely want to hear some more about. So I want to turn to some of our audience questions now. And the first comes from Dory Nolt, and she wants to know, aside from who might be the education secretary, what are some of the stories that are most interesting to you right now as a result of the election?
I want to know how people are talking about this transition in virtual classrooms, because it is intense. I mean, people are just really, the dispute over the validity of the election, what it means, it seems like it could be a really rich opportunity for civics education to teach so many concepts about government works, but it's such a hot potato. And I want to know how classroom teachers are navigating this.
That's a great one. Chris?
I would echo that as well. I'm sure that there in real time learning that there would be a good opportunity for some policy classes in the university level to unpack that. Personally, I'm to touch on what you mentioned earlier, Emily. The idea of what kind of role these college voters played, and I wanted to get to this, but I didn't quite have the chance to. I remember reading a story, I believe, from Penn State talking about younger voters who were making an effort to vote in Pennsylvania rather than, from their home state or wherever they might be registered. So I'm kind of curious, if that was a big effort, or how many students really felt called upon to make that happen this time around. And broadly, I'm interested in the free speech portion and kind of what attitude the administration takes towards it. As I mentioned earlier, I think this past administration, or current administration, as it were, has had kind of a strong touch there. And so I'm curious, what that looks like for colleges now. Do they feel a little bit more comfortable, or is this a new normal where they feel gun shy talking about racism in the classroom, or if they do feel that we need to shy away from affirmative action because that may, maybe it's okay for 4 years, but what happens after that? So that's kind of what I'm curious about as well.
That's a good question. And then a question related for you, Chris, comes from Mindy Reiser, and she wants to know if this damage to the U.S.'s reputation as a haven for international students, how deep is that wound? Is that something that the U.S. can recover from?
So that's something I've definitely been hearing from a lot of people. When the question is like, oh, do I go to the U.S. or do I go to Canada or do I go to England or any other place where that isn't going to necessarily make me jump as many hoops. I think that remains on top of people's minds. But I guess I will also hedge that a little bit and say, I keep a close eye on kind of the college consultant market, and advertising for helping to get students into American universities is still very much at the top of their list, and it's very much I think the priority for a lot of families. So it's a little hard for me to say right at the moment kind of how deep that wound is. I think certainly for at least a year, but I think there will be kind of a testing of the water, to see like, oh, can I send my student there, and is he going to be able to stay, or he or she stay for all 4 semesters, or do I need to be worried about like the outcome of the next presidential election, and are they going to be in a place where like they come home and then they can't return and finish their studies in person? So I think that's a really good question, and I wish I had a better crystal ball to get me more to the end of it.
We have a question from Jim Colmoose, who notes that President Obama had a well-coordinated effort to make evidence-based policy decisions. And he's wondering if you can speculate on whether a Biden presidency would follow that position of basing those policy decisions on existing evidence, on whether something is best practices or is the likelihood of working.
I don't have a good answer for that, except for that, there are some evidence-based requirements in the Every Student Succeeds Act that have remained in place during the Trump administration, and the law's the law. But I don't know that I have anything smarter than that. I don't know if Chris has anything.
I would say that when we're kind of looking at the, just to play to something that I know here, the student debt piece, I know that the Warren plan was pretty heavily researched, and they had outcome, projections for what that would look like for the economy. So, whether that applies to everything, I don't know that I feel that confident speaking for the administration, or kind of, not having a education secretary in place, and not knowing the kind of status of the Senate makes it a little hard for me to prognosticate at this point.
Well, we're talking about ESSA. There's a question from Casey Firestone on whether there's been any discussion of revising ESSA, and also any ADA compliance for online learning and operations.
So ESSA was due for able to be reauthorized last year.
And they've never run late on that, Evie. Never.
Yeah,
Never
no,
run
they
late
always do it exactly on schedule, as we learned with No Child Left Behind.
Correct.
But at that point, everyone was still kind of wanting to sit around and high five that they'd even passed a bipartisan bill. And there were several education groups who said, hey, don't reauthorize ESSA right now. We can't, we're still like getting the ground under us. And we've had, particularly right now, I mean, imagine now with this tremendous interruption to education. Now, there are great concerns about students with disabilities in general that preceded the pandemic. Funding for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is below what Congress allowed itself to spend when it passed the law. And, you know, Vice President Biden has said he would bring that up to full level within 10 years. We'll see if that is something that he can make happen. And then there's also concerns about, you said the Americans with Disabilities Act, did they mean IDEA or they meant specifically ADA?
That's a good question. We'll ask them to let us know in the chat. But
okay, well, I'll just tell you what I know about IDEA, which is that.
Why don't we do that? Because that is what's relevant to education.
Yeah, included in the CARES Act was asking Secretary DeVos to weigh in on whether schools should have any waivers from the requirements of the special education law. And she only favored just a very narrow requirement waiver. Schools would tell you that it has been really hard to manage some of the requirements of IDEA during the pandemic and in remote learning. Families would tell you that we shouldn't let our foot off the gas one bit because their kids' needs aren't being met. And so I would anticipate that if that came up again, it would be a pretty hot issue. But I think that, you know, that issue of how to meet those needs is not going to go away.
I asked Chris to use his crystal ball. Evie, I'll do the same for you. Any speculation about the education secretary?
Well, we hear a lot about union ties, and so we think it might be someone that the unions like, even if it doesn't come directly from a union. Randy Weingarten at AFT, Lily Eskelsen Garcia, perhaps Mary Catherine Ricker she's in Minnesota and used to be with the AFT. I also am curious how if Biden's pledge to appoint a public school educator will be a K-12 teacher, or if there's some wiggle room that it could be a former university instructor, because higher ed is such a huge part of the role of the education department. One of the most high-profile moments from Betsy DeVos's confirmation hearing was Elizabeth Warren grilling her about her experience managing like as a banker, like managing all of the financial end of student aid. And someone pointed this out to me recently and said, are we going to find a K-12 teacher who can also pass that test? This is a really complicated thing to do. And then I would also just say that there is a push from several education organizations that that he should appoint a woman of color to the role. There's some groups backing school superintendents like Janice Jackson in Chicago.
Interesting. Well, certainly there's plenty to speculate. We're just going to have to wait and see on that outcome. So I'm going to give folks just another minute or two to add some final questions. But you know, just some final thoughts from you, Chris, and just anything that you might want to just warn reporters not to get too far ahead of themselves on in terms of making assumptions about what this Biden presidency might mean for education.
Yeah, I would say that you know, harkening back to something I said earlier, you know, free public college is going to be really complicated. You know, I don't imagine that would be something that just rolls out very easily or simply. I would assume that the same is also, you know, kind of in play for the student debt picture, especially given, you know, just how complicated the federal student loan landscape is. I mean, even when we paused, or, you know, when student loans were paused, there was some question about whether or not, you know, want to say it's FFEL loans would be included in that. And, it was like, yes, they will be, but only the ones federally held, the ones that were issued, but federally backed. I don't know that they were included in the same way. And so when you're talking about that, that's just really complicated. And so I would, just urge caution in approaching that as though it was a foregone thing, because it's going to be a sticky process, to say the least.
And Evie, some wisdom from you.
I would not assume that everything Biden does is going to be exactly the way President Obama did it, because he's already indicated in some of his positions and in how much he's worked closely with teachers' unions that his path may be a little different.
Interesting. So just to follow up on Casey Finestone's question, referring to ADA compliance of online learning and operation platforms, apparently they have to be accessible with a screen reader and controlled from a keyboard.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, and I talked to a mother of a student in special ed in Washington who was pushing to have her school reopen in person because she said he had some kind of assistive software that helped him read, and as he transferred between different learning platforms the school was having him use, it worked with some and not with others, and they just felt like a bit of an afterthought. Now, as far as how the federal role in enforcing that and what that would look like, I'm sorry, I don't know that I can tell you anymore. That's a very good question and a concern that a lot of people have.
So we're going to let the last audience question go to Joe Wiggins, excuse me. And Evie, you said that there may be some disenchantment with high stakes tests in the potential Biden administration. What about on the higher ed side, Chris? Is there anything you can tell us there about the future of assessments?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
The future of assessments. Joe Wiggins is asking what that might be for higher ed.
Yeah, I don't see higher ed being kind of there aren't necessarily the same national standardized tests for, college graduates. I mean, there's been a lot of question about kind of what the role of the ACT and SAT is in the future, and kind of whether or not that will continue to remain the dominant paradigm for getting into college. We've already seen a bunch of schools go test optional, not by federal guidance or anything like that, but just by virtue of the fact that in a lot of places you can't take the SAT or ACT, or you have to drive across a couple of states to do it. And is that really fair for students trying to access a public education? So yeah, I hope that's kind of in the ballpark for answering that question.
I just want to mention to everyone, we referenced earlier in this webinar another recent EWA webinar, and that was with Joe Biden's national policy advisor, Steph Feldman, who was on the record for that conversation. We have a transcript of that available on our website, ewa.org. You can find lots of information organized by topic. You're welcome to quote directly from that webinar transcript. Just remember to please cite EWA as your source. I want to take a moment to thank our guest, Evie Blad of Education Week, and also Evie's adorable little dog who stayed quiet for the entire webinar. Congratulations. So good. Don't hex it just yet. Chris Quintana of USA Today, who is a very busy today, was kind enough to take this time with us as well. And finally, I want to thank all of our attendees and EWA members. Without you, obviously, these events would be a lot less interesting. As soon as this webinar closes, you will see an evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is important to us and it helps us to improve. And I am Emily Richmond, your EWA public editor. If there's a story you want to know more about, you need help, just drop me a line on erichmond@ewa.org. And also, we encourage you to listen to EWA Radio, our weekly podcast, where we talk to reporters about the backstories to your reporting. You can find us on your favorite podcasting app, and you can also find us on iTunes. So that's going to wrap it up for everybody. We really appreciate your time. There will be a recording of this webinar available in the next couple of days. We'll post it as soon as we can. So once again, on behalf of EWA, thank you very much for making the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Thanks all.